How's everyone doing? Yay! So my name is Paula Chavarria. I'm from Florida International University. We hope you all have had a fantastic day one of the nice conference, but we're gonna end on a fantastic note with a discussion on information operations, our cybersecurity program, toward a strategic paradigm to combat disinformation. I have the pleasure of introducing Renee DiResta, Technical Research Manager at Stanford Internet Observatory. And joining her will be Brian Fonseca, who you met earlier this morning, and he will join for a conversation. Renee investigates the spread of narrative across social and media networks, with an interest in understanding how platform algorithms and affordance intersect with user behavior and fractional crowd dynamics. Renee led investigations for the Russian Internet Research Agency multi-year effort to manipulate American society and present public testimony, which led to another investigation into influence capabilities that the JRU used alongside attack and leak operations in the 2016 election. And without further ado, I'm happy to welcome to the stage Renee DiResta.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here today. I'm really looking forward to this talk. I'm going to give some remarks for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a chat. So we're going to get towards these solutions, I think, a little bit more in the conversation. But I am going to talk today about some of the ways that we think about disinformation campaigns at Stanford Internet Observatory, particularly kind of structural phenomenon that enable them, and then ways in which they intersect with more traditional cybersecurity concerns. All right, there we go, there are my slides. Okay, so one of the ways that we try to contextualize information operations is with a high degree of specificity about what exactly it is we're talking about. So you hear the word misinformation quite a lot in the media. We tend to use that to mean information that is demonstrably falsifiable. You can, in fact, falsify it. There is a claim that is not true. The Earth is not flat, these sorts of things. It has a tendency to have some scope creep, and that really kind of interferes in the conversation about what mis and disinformation is, what influence is, and how we think about influence operations. Rumors are another great example. In a high-velocity information environment, you are going to have rumors. What you're going to see is things that are not yet known whether they are true or false, but because of the way the information ecosystem works, they will go viral. This is a really big challenge because one of the things that platforms have to try to do is put up some sort of contextualization around what may be true, may be false. Propaganda is a very, very, very old term, dates back to the Protestant Reformation and Pope Gregory. Again, the idea of information with an agenda, information with some sort of inflection. It is intended to make you feel persuaded, feel angry, feel inclined to take an action. It's oftentimes used for distraction. Again, very, very, very old problem with a kind of modern manifestation. Disinformation is where I kind of want to stay in this particular talk. And that is, how do we think about information with an agenda where there is an intent to manipulate? So much the same way you would think about malicious actors trying to gain entrance into a network or to exfiltrate information, when we think about disinformation campaigns, we're thinking about something that does not happen accidentally, but rather it happens very much on purpose. And so there are particular types of campaigns that are happening because there is an intent to influence and an intent to deceive. And oftentimes there's a means to an end. There is something that the agent is trying to do. And one of the facets of disinformation campaigns in particular is the idea of the agent of influence, the entity that is not what they seem, that is operating on behalf of someone else, that is attempting to infiltrate a community, to form a relationship, to ingratiate themselves for the purposes of establishing a relationship of trust or confidence with a targeted population. So one of the ways that we think about these phenomenon in all their myriad forms, but again, for this talk, disinformation and agents of influence, is we think about it as a challenge of internet structures. So the substance of a campaign might be the specific things that the entity is talking about, the specific propaganda leveraged in a campaign, the particular narratives that the agent of influence uses that fit the targeted community. There's a match, between the persona creation and the targeted community. But what we think about when we think about what enables that is we look at the structures. So zero cost publishing, right? The internet really changed, gave everybody the ability to create content. Audience consolidation, many, many millions of people, in some cases billions, all on a handful of platforms. Algorithmic curation, this is where, because there is so much content and so many people on the platforms, with algorithmic curation, it has to decide what to show you. And so this is where we start to get into phenomena like echo chambers or, environments in which you tend to see the same kind of stuff because the algorithms have decided that that is what you want to see. Personalized targeting, where that's even more deliberate. It's not happening accidentally for algorithmic reasons. It's happening because someone is in fact paying to target you with information. Because this is possibly an advertiser, possibly something more nefarious than an advertiser. When we think about, for example, how the Internet Research Agency grew its communities on social media in 2016, some of what they did involved running ads. The ads were remarkably well targeted. They had phenomenally high click-through rates, sometimes upwards of 10 to 12%, which is very, very high for a campaign, directing people to go and join their groups, follow their pages, and then intersect with their agents of influence. So again, advertising and targeting is a way to nudge people into a particular community whereby an actor can subsequently operate and form a relationship. Network effects. Once you have people who are in those communities, the goal is to get them to share, right? Sometimes it's to share the propaganda, sometimes it's to refer the friend, the agent of influence, to another potential target. So we have a network effects phenomenon. Engagement. When we talk about engagement, the goal is always to produce things that are highly, highly sensational, emotionally resonant. The whole point of the campaign is to, again, encourage that act of sharing. And once there is a sufficient degree of engagement on particular pieces of content, the algorithms will pick it up and will boost it to still more people. So that goal of getting engagement is really core to the campaign. Virality and velocity, as I mentioned, is where we think about affordances of the system by which the information moves far faster than a correction might move. Something sensational might reach people long before there's any effort to fact check it, before there's any effort to assess what the rumor actually is. And so we have this relatively frictionless system. And then the final big component is kind of the idea of gameable algorithms. The idea that entities who want to achieve particular aims, particular influence aims, can operate within this system because it is not that hard to figure out how to get something trending. It is not that hard to figure out what kind of ad campaign or targeting to use to reach many, many people. And so that challenge of, again, the algorithms and the affordances and the manipulation of human agency is what really drives modern influence on social platforms today. So just to kind of sketch that out in one really fast process graph here, you create your personas, your agents of influence, you create your content, you seed it to social, so you put it on a couple of different social platforms. There's some initial kind of coordinated amplification. What we often see is some accounts in an operation are tasked with being the persona, the content creator, the entity, the account that sort of drops the initial pieces of content or forms the relationship, and other parts of the network, sometimes hundreds of thousands of accounts, are devoted to its amplification. So they serve primarily as retweeters, they serve as likers, they serve as different sort of contributors in a different way. They're more there to try to game engagement or to game algorithms as opposed to actually be the sort of drop accounts for the content itself. But ultimately, the goal of all of this is to get organic shares. It is really to ingratiate themselves with organic participants to make ordinary people feel that they too should be sharing this content. They're angry about it and they want more people to see it. They're excited about it and they want more people to see it. It resonates and they want more people to see it. And so that is where that act of transitioning from a campaign that is something that is wholly inauthentic into something where those boundaries really become kind of nebulous. What is it when hundreds of thousands to millions of people who are real, who really feel that way about a particular message, then in turn go on to share it. So this is how we start to see that intersection between something that is initially or sort of fundamentally inauthentic or manipulative as it makes its way into a targeted population and then is amplified. And then one of the kind of ideal goals is mass media pickup, where it kind of hops from the social media or online ecosystem for a particular niche to reaching broadcast media with a much larger, broader footprint. So we think of the social media ecosystem as an ecosystem. You almost never see an influence operation confined to one platform. They use all of it. The agents of influence accounts are backstopped. They have personas that are on multiple social media profiles, the same way each and every one of you probably has profiles on multiple social media sites. So when we are trying to gauge who is authentic and who is not, it is actually at times really challenging because it is fairly easy to create online personas at this point. And so when you're trying to figure out, is this person real or not, you're looking at all of these different sites to try to get a sense of, do they have accounts on there? Do they look authentic on there? Is there multiple photos of them on the internet? You know, all these different kind of signals that we use to try to gauge the authenticity of a particular actor in an influence operation. Influence operations adapt to fit the information environment of the day. So again, what I've described is the social media component of it, but there is also an intersection with broadcast media. And I thought I flattened this slide, but my font got weird, so that's supposed to say fronts. So when we think about the intersection between broadcast and social media is additive. And one of the ways that we talk about this when we look at long-standing persistent threats, particularly state actor entities, is that state actors have amassed propaganda apparatus, disinformation campaign techniques, and agents of influence experience over decades. And so oftentimes there's an intersection between what they put out on broadcast media and what they put on social media. And this is in part because broadcast media has a presence on social media. So within the realm of broadcast media and disinformation and influence operations, we see the leveraging of state media. This is what we call white propaganda or attributable propaganda. We see content farms, where oftentimes the content farm is run by somebody who has some tie to the government, but is not necessarily government themselves. We call this gray propaganda. There's some question about the attributability of it all. And then fronts, which are actively misattributed. They are actively pretending to be something that they are not. Those three types of media across that spectrum of overt to covert then in turn all live on social media as well. So you have their websites, maybe you have print or television channels, particularly for very large state actors, and all of those things live on social media too, because old broadcast properties recognize that social provides this unique targetability, this unique type of engagement with an audience, and so they've established presences on there. In some cases, in the hundreds of millions, actually. We see Chinese state media with a little over 100 million followers on some of their pages. We see Russian state media, by contrast, with in the 15 to 25 million or so range of followers for a variety of different channels, which are often then regionalized. So there's this apparatus, and when we look at campaigns, we think about it in the context, actually, of full spectrum propaganda, so full spectrum influence operations. And I'll just walk through some recent thinking on this. So on the left there, or it's my left, yes, it's the left, there's this man by the name of Philip Linden. Philip does not exist. Philip is a sock puppet persona and had a presence on Reddit, on Twitter, primarily Reddit and Twitter. Stolen profile photo, stolen, inverted, edited. Philip primarily spent his time posting Iwo Jima memes. Variety, huge, vast range of different types of Iwo Jima memes. And then writing very, very, very long posts, and unfortunately you can't really see it because the size is small, but we have this up on a blog post on our site. In this particular case, Philip's content, he uses the Iwo Jima meme for a variety of different inflections, for a variety of different culture war touch points in the US, and a variety of different, incorporating the culture war into a variety of different geopolitical issues. And as you may recall, one of the pretexts for the Russian invasion of Ukraine was denazification. And one of the ways in which the Russian government talked about it was that the West should be fundamentally repulsed by Ukraine because they were this nation of Nazis. And so what we see from this particular account is we see this all of a sudden kind of foray into talking about how terrible Ukraine is on LGBT issues with an accompanying Iwo Jima meme. Not all of these things are particularly successful. Philip here did not get very much pickup on any of his platforms. He did write very, very long posts, really trying to get at the nuances of could Americans, be friendly with Ukrainians, and how should they think about their horrible record on LGBT rights. So this is one of these things where the goal is to, kind of nudge public opinion in one way or another, not a particularly effective one in this particular case, but recent. Meanwhile, as this was happening, as we have our Iwo Jima meme guy on the sort of social covert side of the axis, we have overt state media, and overt state media is, the top is RT in English, kind of sending a message that there is not going to be an invasion. This is all NATO hysteria, so you have sort of a party line propaganda. RA fan is where the bottom headline comes from, roughly saying that this analyst, Podolyak, is saying that the Ukrainian government is fleeing. So meanwhile, sort of near-field region language is saying that the Ukrainian government is going to flee, Ukraine is going to collapse, but of course there's not going to be an invasion anyway. But if there was, we shouldn't like them because they're anti-LGBT. So you just have this sort of morass of content across all of the different media types. The one on the bottom there is affiliated with, owned by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who also is affiliated with and is believed to own the Internet Research Agency. So then what we start to see as the conflict progresses is you start to see the leveraging of large accounts on the social media apparatus as well, large official accounts. So when there is a bombing of a maternity hospital, the media begins to cover it in a particular way. The state media denies that it happens, but where they really begin to get their lift is the network of Twitter accounts, the embassy Twitter accounts, which begin to target one of the victims by name, arguing that in fact she is a beauty blogger, encouraging people to search for her. When you search for her, particularly if you search her transliterated name there, as it's spelled, what you find is the state media accounts that are writing about her. So there is, again, this leveraging of the entire propaganda apparatus across overt and covert to shape perceptions, and in this case, kind of disavow responsibility for a particular conflict. And so we see, again, the intent to influence, the intent to deceive. What is possibly most relevant in the current conflict is not Facebook and Twitter. Facebook and Twitter have, in fact, taken down networks from Russia. Sorry, I know Facebook has. I should not say Twitter. Facebook has taken down attributed networks of Russian accounts pretending to be things that they are not, targeting Ukraine. But where we start to see a lot of activity taking place is actually on Telegram, which does not moderate and is not taking things down. And so what you start to see on Telegram is these purported fact-checking channels that begin to spring up. They appear virtually overnight. They do not have a presence prior to this. And what they're doing is fact-checking the claims, saying that all of the allegations around that maternity hospital shelling were fabricated. They then appear again, the same kind of accounts, quote-unquote fact-checking what appeared to be a massacre in Bucha, as confirmed by satellite photos and another number of these other things. But in the social media environment, where there is no moderation, these claims are going viral, and they are purportedly being fact-checked by these accounts that kind of come up out of nowhere. So again, that sort of gray area, it is not directly state attributable, it is not actively misattributed, nobody knows what it is. And so there is this dynamic that takes shape with the intent of nudging the conversation in one direction or another and shaping public opinion. This leads to some really interesting challenges. We start to see now this question of what do you do about all of this? So in the European Union, they begin to ask Facebook and Twitter and actually Telegram as well. They impose sanctions on state media, and they simply censor it. And so this is sort of an interesting, an interesting approach. One of the things that we're looking at now is what is the impact of this, what is the effect that it has. You can still see this content in the US. Again, RT is also regionalized, so there does not appear to be a major dip in its uptake in its Arabic or Latin American channels. There is, of course, a significant dip in its engagement in European channels because this is no longer being pushed to people, it's no longer being curated, and indeed it's no longer being shown in certain areas. At the same time, though, there's this question of, is the censorship approach the ideal approach, or is there something that might be better? This is one of the things that is kind of confronting us in this conflict. You'll note the use of known persistent threat actors, and this is an interesting kind of parallel to cybersecurity. So again, the same way there are kind of APTs that are particularly well known for their intrusion attempts and that sort of, the more kind of cybersecurity side of the house, infiltration, social engineering, things like that. We again at this point have APTs in influence operations as well. We see kind of recurring farms, we see entities that respawn quite regularly, and there is really not very much in the way of deterrence because right now the interventions are largely private platforms deciding what to take down or leave up. And there is no consequence for any of the entities that are running them, and so they just kind of pop up and try again. This is one other kind of facet of this that is interesting. As we've moved through this conflict, of course, there have been a number of different kind of potential war crimes or kinetic operation-related influence operations. And then there's also this pretextual question. The denazification thing didn't really work. It didn't stick. Most people found it kind of ridiculous. But what we did see, so there was not very much pickup. There was not very much denazification narrative pickup in Western media. But what we did see was this claim that the invasion was really about biolabs, bioweapons programs in Ukraine, which were tied to the US Pentagon. And what was very interesting about this is Russia made this argument, but this actually did get widespread domestic pickup. And so this was one of those examples where there's a state media argument, there's kind of overt propaganda about it, there's more extreme claims made in covert spaces, accounts that nobody has attributed, nobody really knows what they are, they talk quite a lot about it, and you don't really know if this is like a domestic anon with an opinion, or one of those kind of agent of influence type accounts until the platform ultimately makes an attribution somewhere down the road. But in the meantime, prior to that attribution being made, the narrative continues to spread. And so what we do see is a lot of organic pickup of the bioweapons claims from within. There's a domestic community called QAnon, sort of a conspiratorial, primarily on the right, kind of cluster of accounts that is highly, highly active and very conspiratorial. They pick these claims up. In fact, they actually are very, very early to it in some ways, possibly even foundationally putting the allegations out prior to state media. There's some kind of debate about the order of operations in which that happened. But ultimately, again, in that progression of kind of dubious accounts, content posted to social media, organic pickup, this is where we start to see that organic pickup. Real people are sharing it now, and the platforms have to decide, what do you do about that? Do you label it? Do you fact check it? What do you try to do in response? And then you see the mass media pickup where it does make it to Fox News. There is some debate about it, and then in kind of pushback against Fox News, you see other kind of more liberal media talking about it as well. And the other guy on my slide over here is a Chinese government official, Ministry of Foreign Affairs official, and what he does with it is China is has a geopolitical dog in this fight as well, and so you start to see Chinese state media and Chinese government and Chinese official accounts pick up the same claim and push it out into their media environment and their media ecosystem, asking again, what is the US government doing with bioweapons labs in Ukraine? Now, whether or not people believe that, of course, is largely a function of what media ecosystem they trust. If they're part of the QAnon community, they might find it quite persuasive early on and feel compelled to share it. If they're part of the community of people who really strongly trust Tucker Carlson and Fox News, they might feel compelled to believe it. If they are not, they're going to find it ridiculous, and there's going to be a fight about what is real and who to trust and who's telling you the truth. And so one of the ways that we think about disinformation campaigns is not for the purpose of persuading the other side, but creating that division, creating that tension, that conflict, and making it feel that it's just too hard to know what's going on. So there's one other piece that I will touch on for this particular audience, which is, and sorry, my fronts is still broken here. I used to say fake news, and then I was like, nah, let me be really clear on what it actually is, and I switched it, and anyway. Hackers. So this is one of the areas where, going back to 2016 or 2018, if you recall, a lot of the focus of what happened in the 2016 election when people talk about state actor manipulation campaigns is the Internet Research Agency with the memes and the Facebook targeting and the stuff that I was kind of describing, the agents of influence. But the other thing that happened, the thing that really moved the news, very little of what the IRA did got massive mainstream media coverage. A couple protests here, they did a lot of like real world organizing, driving people to go to protests, and then there was like footage of those protests that made the news, that kind of thing. But what was really impactful was actually the hack and leak operation. And this is where my team did some work assessing GRU operations, which were happening concurrently. So the Internet Research Agency was running this very social-first, meme-first strategy, but Russian military intelligence, APT-28, was running this operation by which they were using spear phishing campaigns to hack political campaigns to obtain documents and then to dump them strategically in tranches. To push them, they created personas and they pushed them to news media, and news media reported on the content, not on the provenance so much. Much more the focus was on the content. This was actually where the Pizzagate conspiracy comes from. It comes from those troves of documents. So again, there are domestic groups that find this quite compelling that then in turn pick it up, and it becomes a major, massive story in a way where the Internet Research Agency, agents of influence, were much more involved in nudging people in particular niche communities. What the GRU manages to accomplish is transforming the national conversation through the hack and leak. And this is where, we still see this. This is kind of an ongoing investigation that is happening now. My team is actually not involved in this one, but it was last week, I think it was May 25th or something like that. Russian cyber attack group Cold River is who Google attributed this to. Again, a spear phishing campaign. These are British politicians with Proton Mail accounts, and they kind of fell prey to this spear phishing campaign, and Cold River is, again, the attribution. Oftentimes, we're reliant on the platforms to make the attribution, so this comes from Google. And that is where now there is a trove of documents that has been put out from their email. This is related to Brexit. And of course, immediately upon the documents being released, again, you start to see state media picking them up and digesting them, putting the story out in a particularly incentivized way. This time around, media that is covering the documents is also referring to their provenance, so this is a bit of a difference back from 2016. But of course, there's the denial, and there's the Russian state media saying, of course, they're blaming Russia rather than focusing on the substance of the email. So they're just trying to get the focus back to the substance. So I know we have to get started on our conversation, but there's this question that lingers then, which is who is ultimately responsible for this? So there are a lot of questions that I've raised in these 20 minutes or so, which is with the content, with the operations that exist on social platforms are de facto responsible, right? And there is no one else who can be, and so you have integrity teams at platforms that are looking for these networks and taking them down. When it comes to state media, the line is quite a lot blurrier. There's retaliatory action if Google chooses to block, if the social platforms choose to block state media from a particular country. Oftentimes the country will in turn block them internally, leading to interesting questions about, have you just prevented the people in that country from access to information because of this retaliation? So there's some interesting challenges there. But on this question of the intersection with cybersecurity, with infiltration campaigns, with much more direct attacks, this can happen to anyone, and that is the interesting challenge, right? It can happen to political campaigns, but there's also potential for corporate targeting as well. And oftentimes what we see is, rather than infiltration or exfiltration of data and documents being used for the purposes of enriching or increasing the knowledge of the actor who goes and gets them, it's actually for use in a subsequent information campaign or influence operation. So that's where that intersection comes into play, where you have persistent threat actors that are tied to states who are doing the work of obtaining documents, not so much only for their, again, their own awareness or ransomware or these other sorts of factors, but actually for purposes of geopolitical use in the context of dumping them on social media and letting the social media machine do its work. And with that, I think we're going to go to our conversation.
All right. All right. Well, hello, everyone. First and foremost, you're an absolute rock star in this space, and we're so fortunate to have you with us today to talk about what I think is an incredibly consequential issue that we're facing, and one that is very much interconnected with the cyber realm, and specifically cybersecurity is a discourse we're talking about. So here's the plan. I'm going to drive conversation for about 15 minutes with Renee. So I'll probably toss out maybe 3 or 4 questions, and then I want to go straight to the audience and incorporate the audience into the conversation. We have mics on the outside. I'll give you sort of the cue when it's time to start lining up for mics. I think I'll be able to take maybe 2 or 3 questions from the audience, and so start thinking about really tough questions. I'm going to ask the easy questions. They're going to ask the tough questions. No, in all seriousness, cybersecurity practitioners are not new to this information space, and in fact, semantic attacks, manipulation, conducted largely by trying to change cognition through misinformation or through disinformation, has been a pretty common challenge for information security professionals. And so what's different about the context that cybersecurity professionals are operating in today, and the impact of computational or automated attacks, and what should we be doing today to educate cybersecurity practitioners of this sort of new normal?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the challenges, a couple of years back, I worked at a company that spent some time thinking about this in the context of corporates, actually, right? How should corporations think about these things? And one thing that remains unclear is whose responsibility this actually is within a company, right? So there's, CISOs tend to think of their purview as what's on the network, maybe, or perhaps there's additional facets related to executive security. There's the brand people who are responsible for thinking about public perception and reputation management. But these two things don't necessarily talk to each other. There's no clear, nobody is really obviously in charge, and that I think is one of the interesting dynamics. You may remember this was a purely domestic campaign, but there's a message board called 4chan, 8chan, and there was an incident at Starbucks a few years back where I believe it was 2 black men were asked to leave. They were not drinking coffee in the store; they were just sitting there. They were asked to leave. And this led to some national outrage, right? This was sort of an incident of racism. Starbucks decided that they were going to do some training. There's a whole national conversation about it. And this provided an interesting opportunity for the trolls of 4chan to decide to capitalize on this moment. And so what they did, I don't know how many of you heard about this, I'd be curious to see a show of hands. They made fake coupons, and they put them out on Twitter. Did anybody hear about this? Okay, I see like one. This is a case study that actually is really worth understanding if you do work thinking about kind of corporate reputation and who is responsible. Because what wound up happening was these coupons said, come in, the best conversations start over a cup of coffee, come in for one on us, and it said free black coffee was the thing. And it also said in the kind of the fake fine print of these very realistic looking coupons that this was only for black people. Only black people could bring these coupons into the store, leading to a whole second wave of, kind of outrage and debate on Twitter where they effectively sort of recognized the rage of, the real public outrage about this moment, created a secondary wave, and then Starbucks has to figure out what they're going to do about this. So is this a comms problem? Who is ultimately responsible for this sort of trolling? And it was a very sort of small instance of one of these things. This was pretty early, but you started to see this happening with things like movie reviews being bombed by incentivized review manipulation campaigns. Black Panther was another such review manipulation coordinated on 4chan and 8chan. And what you started to see happening there was, again, there's this question of how do you figure out if this is real or fake? How do you assess social media conversation and figure out if these are real people or if these are trolls? If you work in an extractive industry or you work in a pharmaceutical or an industry, agriculture is another one, where there are potentially geopolitical implications to your work, you're an international corporation, and you have a vaccine, for example, right? And your vaccine competes with a vaccine of another sovereign nation, and there's a bit of an information war about who's safer. These are the sorts of things where there is no one tasked with this within companies, and that's where I think, even as most companies today would recognize the value of a CISO, would recognize the importance of ensuring that your executives understand the nature of these dynamics, can assess when a campaign is worth responding to or not. That's kind of a different type of situational awareness, or that is really at this point kind of owned by nobody. And that's where I think a lot of the challenges as we think about what this looks like going forward, and it's more corporate adaptations, that I think becomes one of the key questions for cybersecurity professionals today.
Yeah. So you kind of hint at actors, and I know you talked a little about in your presentation about sort of the actors that are proliferating in this information space. They seem a lot similar to the types of actors that we're seeing in the more sort of pure cybersecurity space, right? A broad range of society, public, private sectors that are engaged in information operations. Can you talk a little bit about maybe sort of that ecosystem of actors and how that might converge or differentiate from cybersecurity to the cybersecurity landscape?
So state actors are prevalent. They're everywhere. We've worked on takedowns attributed to various entities within Iran. Jordan, the Jordanian Air Force, ran a TikTok manipulation campaign. That one was really weird. It was mostly like just sort of pro-Air Force propaganda of the kind that if they ran it with authentic accounts would have been totally innocuous. You wouldn't have paid attention, but it was that they created a bunch of fake people to do it with. I'm trying to think of any governments that we haven't looked at this point. Russia and China are probably the most recurring. Again, it's like whack-a-mole. The network comes down and it's right back up. And I think that is where you get at what we call the sort of most well-resourced full-spectrum entities, right? That have access to a broadcast and media environment. That's sort of the dynamics I was trying to get at with these very complicated Ukraine situations, like what this looks like across the spectrum. But then we also do see terrorist organizations use it for propaganda purposes and recruiting, which is a different manifestation. If you've given everybody the tools of creation and the tools of dissemination and the tools of targeting and just those sort of structural factors that I ran through in the beginning, and you think about what can different actor types do within those structures, and that's where you start to get a sense of how do spammers operate, how do trolls, domestic trolls, we all, every country has them, how do they operate? And then there's also this kind of secondary question there, which is who is having impact. Not all of the Chinese networks have impact. Some of them get almost no engagement. So they exist, they're there, we see them, but we don't see them succeeding. Sometimes it's actually so bad that we'll kind of, talk in researcher back channels and say, like, what is the point of this? Why are they bothering? Like, sure, we've got to be missing something. This is a, highly skilled adversary in so many different ways. How are their influence operations so bad? And there's some theories about, might they be pushing out low-quality bot contributions into particular hashtags, actually to just raise the differential for getting something trending. If you're constantly spamming it, do you change the delta at which the algorithm determines that something has trended? That's interesting if that's what's happening. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of garbage accounts throwing spam into a hashtag with no discernible impact. So we try to think about what are the different, within the structures, what tactics are possible. Within actor resourcing, what kinds of capabilities do they have? And then on this question of impact, the very real reality is that it's actually domestic trolls that really understand the sort of psyche of the communities that they're targeting. So very authentic people who can use this tool of influence to influence. But it's not immediately obvious where the line crosses into manipulation, and that remains one of the key challenges in thinking about responses.
You mentioned bots, and I can't let it go by with the opportunity to talk a little bit about bots and bot networks particularly, because we're starting to see them surge quite rapidly in the information space. And I've noticed that you're starting to see the proliferation of bot mitigation teams and bot mitigation as a profession sort of woven into maybe more traditional cybersecurity or tech positions. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what that is and
Yeah, so some of it is, so automated actors, right? Again, when I was kind of in the very start of my comments, the difference between the actors that try to be a persona, that try to create an account and do something, when they are trying to be a persona, they're often trying to establish a relationship. So there's a very kind of direct, intentional way in which they interact with audiences or with media. But the bot accounts are much more of a spray and pray. And so you'll see them in a hashtag, you'll see them programmed to kind of draft in somebody's replies. Elon Musk, for example, this of course is a topic of major national interest right now as Elon decides whether or not to go through with his acquisition of Twitter. One of the interesting dynamics for somebody who is very, very famous and has a very, very large following is large numbers of networks of bots will spam the replies, usually in this particular case with cryptocurrency scams, hoping to pull people into communities. So they'll have a Discord link maybe, and then they're trying to pull people into a Discord community where they'll scam them, or they will. Telegram channels are also quite common on that front, or they will do manipulative things like asking people for wallet information, or trying to kind of spam them or scam them right there on the platform. So there's a variety of different automated types. But one of the goals is if you are you're kind of trying to create as large a target-based surface as possible by reaching as many people as possible. And so what you see these networks doing is they'll often be using the same URL, the same domain. They're trying to get people to do something, and that's where it kind of intersects also with this financially motivated as opposed to politically motivated actors who are using the system, using the capabilities of the system for manipulation that usually revolves around something financial.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question that I'm hoping Rodney is going to really appreciate. So Rodney, this question's for you. Presumably, uncovering deceit and deception is sort of at the core of what the U.S. intelligence community has really been focused on as of late, trying to really grasp and understand how to navigate the surging information operation landscape. The NICE framework includes a collection of work roles categorized as analyzed that covers individuals who perform highly specialized review and evaluation of incoming cybersecurity information to determine its usefulness for intelligence. The question is, have we reached or have we seen sort of a surge in which intelligence is no longer strictly under the purview of the US government, and where we're seeing a surge, and we can talk about Ukraine, the importance of the open source environment, but where we're seeing a surge in private sector organizations that are becoming really foundational in terms of protecting organizations from the proliferation of disinformation.
So that's a really complicated topic. So back in 2015, I'll just give an anecdote. I did some work looking at ISIS networks on Twitter. And there was a question of who should respond. Again, this question of who is actually responsible. And particularly, here in the US, where we don't want to see our government interfering in speech or hoovering up vast amounts of data, it is very hard to assess social media communications without ingesting or inadvertently engaging with American citizens. Again, you don't know who the other person is, you don't know where they are, and so there are a couple of laws on the books that really sort of prevent the government from having as sort of sophisticated an understanding of the environment as other governments potentially do that are not similarly constrained. And so this is not a bad thing, but what it does mean is that when we think about how should we understand influence operations, there has been this rise of private companies, private contractors that serve in a way as they will sort of produce an intelligence product to help inform the government about or whoever or the corporation, even sometimes it's corporations who are trying to get a handle on this stuff. And so this question of, again, who is responsible even for that basic situational understanding, this is where you start to see the rise of communities of providers that take on government contracts or that do government work to try to make the understanding of the information arena to kind of go alongside with their understanding of other facets of geopolitical arenas or the cybersecurity landscape that they are not kind of constrained from understanding. So how do they assess what is happening in one part of the ecosystem compared to the other? When I did some work for the Senate Intelligence Committee analyzing the 2016 the 2016 Russian information operation, the one targeting the U.S. over a period of years. And what was interesting about that was, the platform companies provided the data to Congress, who in turn leveraged outside researchers to try to analyze it. Again, just the sort of capability gap. How do you assess kind of 400 gigs worth of this content, even though all the PII had been stripped out? We had no visibility into how people were reacting to it or anything like that. But even just doing that analysis, there are some questions around how to best create those relationships. For election integrity in particular, you have things like DHS CISA, who are tasked with ensuring the integrity of American elections. How do they have visibility into what is happening in the information environment as well? As we all saw, the Disinformation Governance Board was poorly rolled out. Nobody knew what the hell the thing was, why it had any justification, and there was massive outrage at the very idea that such a thing would even exist. So this is where that tension between who is responsible for ensuring the integrity of elections without understanding the information space related to elections becomes one of these kind of continuing points of tension. Who has the moral authority or the legitimacy to do that work? And that's an ongoing challenge in the space, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of disaggregating responsibility from, deliverers of information, consumers of information, originators of information in the policy landscape. I'm going to ask two more questions, and then if you can start lining up to the mic, I'd like to weave questions in from the audience. If you don't line up, I have 15 more questions, and I've been instructed to go through all 15 before we're able to break for the reception. So slight nudge. Okay, there we go. We got takers. Okay. All right, so much of cybersecurity is reactionary, protecting data, systems, networks, and people against adversaries. What should or could we be doing proactively to address the architecture and design of systems or processes to prevent information warfare from becoming a risk to organizations and individuals?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I think one of the real challenges is the speed with which this happens, right? One of the things that we see is that if there is any success, right, if an adversary has any success in manipulating, let's say, trends, hypothetically, Twitter trends, right, then there's going to be a community of people who have begun to participate in the trend unwittingly. They don't know where it originated from or why. But once they participate, if they see the trend disappear, then they feel that they're being censored, right? Then there's a belief that there's been some sort of, someone has put their thumb on the scale. And meanwhile, the platform has to try to figure out, is this an inauthentic network? What is this? Why is this trending? So this all has to happen very, very quickly, because if there's any success at all, there's going to be visibility, and when the visibility ceases, there's going to be an allegation of censorship. And so that dynamic, I think, is one of the, the real points of tension in this particular informational environment. What can we do? And so one of the questions, one of the things that, if you think about this as where the structure and the substance are two different things. Again, whatever narrative, targeting the right, targeting the left, this is a global problem, so targeting whatever, spectrums of right and left exist in countries around the world. If you hold all that stuff aside, are there ways to create a system that is better architected in some way? Right, and that's where some of the thinking around design comes into play. So rather than thinking about content moderating the end output, is there an opportunity to think about the design of the network up front? So this takes the form in some ways of thinking about, should recommendation engines be trying to connect people to other people? Right? There are some arguments that it makes for a better user experience, maybe. You start to feel like you have more friends. But when recommendation engines push people into communities, there is a fundamentally different type of network that happens there. You have these very high homophily networks. You have people who are very, very like-minded. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a thing, right? And this is where we look at some of my favorite work being done in the space right now is actually out of emergent biology, which says there are ways in which network structures can be phenomenally productive, where information moves in a way such that the community becomes informed. And then there are have you ever seen the video of ants that periodically lose the pheromone trail and the network just walks in circles until it dies, right? So, so there are these really interesting dynamics that the assemblage of communities is something that people are looking at now. is there a point beyond which networks are too big? What are the negative consequences that come out of that? Are there ways to use design, even holding network structures aside, but just put people into a more reflective mindset? If you go to share something that the platform thinks might be tied to an inauthentic operation or a manipulation campaign, might it pop up a nudge that just says like, hey, this is a rumor right now. We don't actually know what this is. Giving the user a choice at that point, exercise their agency and decide, do I want to share that thing? Do I want to continue? Yes, I'm mad about it, but do I really need to share it in this moment, or might I wait an hour and get more of a sense of what is happening? So are there ways to use friction and design to sort of change the velocity and virality components of how networks transmit information? Might that give users the ability to retain some agency while at the same time minimizing some of the kind of worst downstream impacts? So that's sort of some of the work that I'm most excited about is happening more in those types of areas in the design spaces.
Thanks, Renee. I'm going to save my second question for the very end if we have time, because I see folks lining up and I don't want to miss the opportunity to hear their questions. So, sir, let's start back here with yours, and then we'll go over here.
First of all, thank you very much for the great presentation and all the information on Russia's disinformation campaign and propaganda. For the past more than 8 years, I've been observing how Russia's disinformation has gotten into mainstream media all over the world, including the US media and main information resources on social media. As we all know from different resources, Russia has been spending amounts of funding close to their defense budget every year since early 2000s. So to build up on the last question, how do we protect ourselves, especially in the light of First Amendment and freedom of speech, which we still don't want to trump on, and want to make sure that freedom of speech is still there. However, an example of Russia's disinformation, we can see how it could affect the outcome of elections. We could see how Russia's disinformation could affect the way the war is going. For example, when they were starting the offensive on Ukraine, they saw that denazification didn't work. They started talking about biolabs. They started talking about and spreading disinformation about Ukrainian government, how corrupt it is, and how Ukrainian government is being used by Western powers to launder the money. And all of these pieces of information found themselves in social media and even in mainstream media. Luckily, people are starting to get a wind of it and filtering it out. But still, in the end, with such humongous resources being spent by Russia, how can we stop that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a real challenge. I would say, so we've talked about design, right, and the sort of structural side of it. There is policy, and that's sometimes platform policy. Again, the kind of what should they do in these particular cases. How do you think about state media in wartime? This is actually a much bigger question than one conflict. This is a thing that is going to continue to happen, unfortunately, likely, in other regions of the world as well. So what is the policy that should be in place there? But I think the other piece is the education piece. And this is where I spend a lot of time. I went and I dug up, about a month ago, these primary sources from the Institute of Propaganda Analysis. I don't know how many people are familiar with that effort, but during the Cold War and a little bit prior, so between kind of World War II, World War I, World War II, and then into the Cold War, there were government responses, actually. There were government counter-propaganda responses. And there was the Active Measures Working Group, right, which recognized that there were kind of ongoing campaigns. And what's very interesting about Active Measures Working Group is their response. I was thinking about this a lot as that DHS governance board debacle was happening, because we did used to believe that government had a role to play. And the role that it played then was that it would highlight these campaigns. The mission was to find them and then to expose them. And it was not to counter them. What they did just over and over again was just put it out to the public. Here's what is happening, here's what is happening, here's what is happening. And there was such a degree of transparency there. You can go back and you can read the archives of the Active Measures Working Group. You can see the reports that they put out. And it's very interesting because they're not, there is no response, there's no, and we're going to take this down, or any of the things that people were very afraid of in the media coverage of this, admittedly stupidly named thing that DHS thought it was going to do. But what was interesting is that if you look back at Active Measures Working Group, there is this recognition that the government informing the public about what is happening is absolutely foundational to reducing its impact. The other thing, the Institute for Propaganda Analysis was kind of like the equivalent of an NGO. It was journalists, it was sociologists, professors, academics, a bunch of different types of people who participated in this thing. And these documents are a lot harder to find. They weren't particularly well archived. But what they do, again, is they annotate the content. And so they're just going through it. Sometimes it's domestic. They're taking Father Coughlin's speeches, and they're saying, here is the rhetoric. Here is how the rhetoric works. Let us just walk through the specific types of rhetoric that are being used in this particular speech for the goal of evoking a reaction from the audience. Here is why you feel angry when you hear this. And again, it's not countering it, it's not trying to take it down, it's not arguing for its censorship, it is just saying, here is how it works. And I really do think that that potentially is the answer, bringing back that conceptualization of what it means to educate the public about propaganda in that very methodical, way that I don't know if the best source of that education is government or if it's an NGO civil society type thing. But I do think that we had, again, it's an old problem, new forms, new opportunities for design and a bunch of other ways to think about the structure. But just on that educational front, I kind of feel like we sort of forgot, all the stuff that happened during those decades, and it might be interesting to see what does that response type look like today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Last question. Go for it.
Thank you for the great presentation again. Thinking of the alliances that U.S. has built for the last 8 decades around the world, and the misinformation taking place in those allied countries as well, either as an anti-American perception or like Brexit, changing this global spectrum. How do you think, are there any efforts to help those allies in their own misinformation campaigns? Or how do you think the response over here can be transferred to the allies as well? Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot of, again, I don't work for government, so I don't have as strong a sense of what's happening in those channels, but I do know in academia, we put everything that we do at Stanford, everything we do, we put out publicly. This is very important to us. It's on our website in PDF format. There's no secrets about what we're doing. We do engage with, the regulators in Europe who say, what should we do about this? I remember visiting Singapore and having a conversation. Again, they ask the same questions. Most governments are concerned about this, right? They're concerned about its impact on their citizens. They're concerned about what happens, there's particularly countries with a very strong commitment to freedom of expression have to confront the fact that freedom of expression is actually in a way used against them, right? Because once that content goes up, there's a real reluctance to take it down, and that's that's that question of if we aren't taking it down, what are we doing with it? You can think about in the context of state media, again, in the US, we have the Foreign Agent Registration Act, right? Which says that media from foreign governments, media from foreign sponsors is fine. American audiences can receive that, but there should be a disclosure. The customer should be informed, right? The recipient should be informed. And so what does it look like to again, preserve that freedom of expression, not trying to censor communications from outside, but how do you inform the audience in the age of these new structures? So this is where the state media labeling initiative, you may have recalled when I showed that image of the account from the Chinese foreign minister. He has a tag and it says state media, I think there's one label for media and there's one for government. Chinese government linked account, I think is what it says. And that's an example of a retaining a commitment to a plurality of voices, retaining the ability for the public to see what is going on and what is being said, while at the same time informing the public such that it knows where the message is coming from. And that, I think, is one of these areas where we're not necessarily doing it perfectly yet, but those initiatives are only about 2 years old. They really began to think about them in the context of COVID, actually, was when those labeling initiatives really began, particularly as this conversation about, at the time, the bioweapons allegations was that, was COVID a bioweapon from a Chinese lab or Fort Detrick? Was this like weird information battle that was kind of playing out, and so another one of these little like kind of blips that captivated the public for some time there, though. So I think this question of, there's information sharing, Western governments saying, here's what we're seeing, here are the operations that are targeting our country, here are the ways in which different groups of, different entities, different actors are using these tactics in conjunction with the following. I think that this framework is pretty common in cybersecurity too. Like, here's our kind of understanding of what has happened, here's a sort of action report, and making that available and having conversations about it.
And then our charge as academics is to weave it into curriculum in ways that we can condition culture, not just about sort of the cyber landscape, but the cyber-enabled operations that we see in the information space as well. And that was going to be my last question that you sort of answered, which is really a cultural shift, and working down to ensure that even kids today have a better understanding of the information landscape. Yeah,
I think that's key. I mean, my oldest is going into 3rd grade. Last day is on Friday of 2nd grade. And I remember him coming home with a little module trying to teach 2nd graders that not everything you read not everything you saw on YouTube, not even read on the internet, not everything you saw on YouTube was true. And it was a Canadian module, actually. It was like does Prime Minister Trudeau keep a hippo in his bathroom? And there was like a news report that Prime Minister Trudeau had a house hippo. And it was basically asking the kids to think critically, like, yeah, somebody on YouTube is saying it, and it looks very real, and it looks like news, but do people keep hippos in their bathtubs? And I actually don't really think it's 2nd graders that are the problem, but but kind of rolling that education out, kind of across across the age culture. Spectrum. Yes, right. Exactly.
Right. And so Randy's given me the cue that I can ask the other 15 questions. Okay. I know he hasn't actually. Please join me in thanking Renee for being with us today.